So glad to see you all here this evening. Laura, you have presented to our group before in the past, and I think you know we record all of our programs. Back when we began this during the height of COVID, nobody went anywhere. And so people tended to be glued to their computer screens. Now people have more options, but we find that we're getting dozens of views of the videos that we record. And we know that the issue that you're going to talk about this evening is of particular importance, certainly to residents of Delaware, although we have folks here from New Jersey as well. But we know that the degree to which we can provide meaningful, effective education to students in the state has an incredible impact on the future of our communities, as well as the individuals that are involved. And we also know that basically there has been study after study after study in the state of Delaware about ways to improve the educational system and the outcomes of our educational approach. I was stunned in doing a little bit of background. It appeared that the funding mechanism or the formula that's in place in Delaware has been there for decades. And 1940, I think, was the date that I read, which is when you think of everything
The
that
year I was born.
when you think of everything that is now, Susan's very young, but when you think of all the things that have happened since then, that formula is still in place, certainly seems to be an artifact of where we've been and not where we are, and how we might most effectively serve the children in our community. So I am going to highlight you and are you going to have any screens to display, Laura,
Oh,
or
geez, no, I'm sorry. I didn't know you were
not a
looking for that
problem?
type of presentation.
Not a problem at all.
Okay.
It's just that I would make you a co-host so that you could share your screen if you were going to do that. But yeah, no problem at all. So let me go ahead and spotlight you and turn the program over to you. Laura Sturgeon is Delaware State Senator. She happens to be my state senator. And has an amazing background in education in the state of Delaware. So would seem to be the ideal person to chair the new Delaware, yeah, I'm not going to get
Public Education Funding
public
Commission.
education. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. So we are very grateful to have you here tonight and anxious to hear your thoughts about the hopes for that commission, the work that's ahead of it, how you see it proceeding, and sort of what your hopes and dreams are for the students in our community.
Well, thank you, Sue, and thanks for inviting me to speak about a subject that is very important to me and all of us, of course. We all care about our schools being the best they can be, not only because we care about the future of the young people who attend those schools, but we care about how it makes Delaware look, whether young families are attracted to come here to work and things like that. People want to make a life here. I know that there's a perception that our public schools aren't that great, and sometimes that leads people to seek, living across the border in Pennsylvania if they can't afford to send their kids to private school. I hope that that's more perception than reality, but there is some data that tells us that some of it is reality. So thanks for letting me talk about this super important subject. My background is I taught for 25 years in Delaware public schools, for 17 in the Votech school district, Newcastle County Votech, and then the last 8 years at Concord High School in Brandywine School District. And then when I won my election in 2018, I was immediately appointed to be chair of education in the Senate. So I'm able to take all those real world experiences from teaching and apply them now to policy making, legislating, vetting legislation that comes along, and moving forward good legislation, and sometimes even blocking bad legislation, or at least from my point of view and the point of view of my colleagues. So, um, something that's been an outstanding issue since even before I was elected has been this funding piece. And a little history on the funding, like you mentioned, the funding formula that we use is ancient, or well, I won't say ancient, since some people are as old as the funding formula, and you're not ancient, but it's old. It's been around a long time. For me, that by itself is not necessarily such a damning thing. I mean, there are a lot of things that have been around a long time and work well. So I'm less like persuaded by the argument that because it's old, it's bad. But um, but so I'm not like gonna really dwell on how long we've had the funding formula in place, but rather on its effectiveness and lack of effectiveness and how we could do better. So the formula we have now is really complicated in a way. It's called a unit count system. And what it does is for every certain number of students, um, I'm just going to make up numbers, they're not going to be accurate, but let's say for every 20 students that a school has, that generates a unit, which is a teacher. So for every 20 units, student units, you generate a teacher unit. And then for every, I don't know what the number is, but again, I'm just making up numbers. For every um, maybe 50 teacher units, you generate a principal or an assistant principal. And then for every assistant principal, every two assistant principals, you generate a principal. And it's kind of like that. It's like a pyramid. And um, there are and the problem is there's also that's not the only source of funding is the unit count. That's how the state funding works. But then there's these other funds that are federal. There's the local portion that comes from, the school tax, which you get to vote on through the referendum process. Um, it gets pretty complicated because there's so many different funding streams. But that's the basics of the unit count. It's based on the number of students, generates a certain number of teachers, generates a certain number of administrators, and so forth. And when you say it generates a certain number of teachers, they've also thrown in, well, a teacher could be a counselor or it could be a librarian. So it's not necessarily for every 20 students you get a classroom teacher. You might have to use one of those units as a school counselor or as a librarian. Um, so it's a little bit deceptive in that you're not even necessarily getting that many classroom teachers or personnel that's going to come face to face with students every single day. So that's how it's worked in Delaware since the 1940s, I guess is when it started. And a lot of other states had it too. But over the years, many states have moved to um, a student-based system rather than a unit-based system. And I guess the difference is they set a dollar amount to each student. And then that dollar amount follows the student. And some people think that that's a better system and more transparent. Um, I will say though that, for example, in the student-based system, students with special needs generate get a higher dollar amount. Let's say low-income earners, depending on the state and what they've decided, but certainly low-income earners, or sorry, low-income students or students from low-income families, they could also generate they could be worth more, if you will, in terms of the dollar amount that is attached to them and that the school that they attend gets for them. You can weight how much a student is worth based on their needs. Um, if you use the student based funding. The thing is, we do that with the unit count as well, which is why you're going to be able to tell that I'm a bit, I don't know if ambivalent's the right word, a little bit ambivalent, but more just sort of neutral or agnostic is usually the term I use about which funding system we use, which I think in a way makes me a good chair of this commission because I'm not trying to push an agenda. I really want to hear all the ideas and move us in the direction that seems best for Delaware and that we can agree to. But let me explain. So if you have a pure weighted student funding system, weighted student funding is what they call the system that is kind of considered the alternative to what we do. You would have more money would follow a student that is from a low income background if you choose that as one of the criteria. More money would follow a student that has a learning disability. More money would follow a student who's an English language learner. Okay. But we also do that through the unit count system. And the way we do that is, remember when I said in the unit count system, using numbers that we can play with here that are easy to understand. If we say 20 students equals one teacher, if the students are identified as having learning disability, that ratio goes down. So it only takes, say, 8 students with a learning disability to generate a teacher. So it would be wrong to say that we don't adjust for special circumstances because we do, even under the unit count system. Um, if it's 20 regular ed students is what equals one teacher, for every 20 equals one teacher or part thereof, but every 8 students with a learning disability, generates one teacher. You can do the same thing with income. You can say every 6 low income students generates a teacher. Every, 9 students from English who are multilingual learners would generate a student. So would generate a teacher. So you can kind of approach the idea of certain students need more resources using either of these 2 options, the weighted student funding option or the unit count option. You just create, smaller ratios, smaller numbers of students required to generate a teacher and so forth. So for me, the most important thing is that we make sure our students are getting the resources they need. And I personally am, like I said, agnostic as to whether we use the unit count system, a weighted student funding system, or what I suspect is most likely going to happen, but it's too early to say because we've only had 2 meetings so far, a hybrid system between those 2. We're already kind of in a hybrid situation now in that we still have the unit count, but a few years ago, you may recall, Governor Carney introduced something called opportunity funding. And he pledged like $60 million over the next several years, specifically for students from low-income backgrounds and multilingual learners. And like I said, we already have an adjustment for students with learning disabilities. The number of students with learning disabilities required to generate a teaching unit is much lower than the number of students without a learning disability. So to acknowledge the fact that students from low-income backgrounds and English language learners, or now I guess multilingual learners is the term that is more used, in order to accommodate their needs and the resources they require, Governor Carney started applying opportunity funding, and the legislature approved the budget to do this. So it's a hybrid because we have the unit count as sort of the base system, but layered on top of that, we have a weighted student funding system for students who are English language learners and low income. So we have a hybrid model now. The question is it adequate? And based on some of the reporting out there, some of which I don't think captures the full picture, but I'll grant that I don't think we're funding our schools enough. And based on the outcomes, it would seem we're not funding our students, especially our low-income students, mostly our low-income students enough. So we're going to have to do some things. Okay. There are people on the commission, that this 31-person commission that was created through a resolution that I introduced last June, and that now has only met twice so far. So we're hard at work, but we're still in the early days. Our job is going to be to decide what the funding system looks like. Are we going to keep unit count and continue to layer weighted funding on top of unit count, kind of like what Carney did, but make those amounts higher to really meet the needs of those students? Or are we going to completely scrap the unit count and go to more of a pure weighted student funding system? But importantly, for me, more importantly than which system we use is how much money are we going to invest in the system? And what we're using as sort of our guideline is a report called the AIR report. I think it's the American Institute of Research, that we paid a lot of money, taxpayer money, to have this report made up. And the report found that we are underinvesting in our students by somewhere between 600 million and $1 billion a year. Those are really, I know, overwhelming sounding numbers, but they didn't just pull these numbers out of a hat. The researchers looked at surrounding states, and not just surrounding states, but the states that have the highest, the best outcomes for their students, and how much they invest in their education system and their public education system per student. And they found that really every state that is looked at as, oh, they have such a great system. States like Massachusetts and Connecticut come to mind, even New Jersey, all the states who have better outcomes on standardized tests and things like that that are used to measure student learning and student growth invest far more in their students than we do. And especially if you adjust for poverty and special needs and multilingual learners. So sometimes when you hear, and you've probably heard it, I think there was even a billboard on I-95 once that said this recently, like Delaware invests the fifth most in their students per state, but we're like the fourth from the bottom in outcomes. So I kept hearing that talking point from certain people who are invested in making our schools look bad, probably for political reasons. And so I asked some, education think tank people to dig into that for me and explain how is this possible? How are we, if we're investing that much, why are our outcomes so bad? And they said that the nuance that's missing from that billboard and from that talking point you'll hear is the total number we invest is meaningless if you're not adjusting for need. So while we may invest, what I've heard is the truth is we invest around the middle. Like we're not fifth from the top in investment per pupil. We're really more like tied for 10th place or for 20th place with so many other states. And then you can take the tie and you can just like put us at the top and make it look like we spend the fifth most per pupil. So my understanding from education think tanks that are not particularly partisan, well, that aren't partisan at all, is that we're really kind of somewhere in the middle. But then once you account for the percentage of our public school students who are below the poverty line, who have identified learning disabilities and who are multilingual learners, and you tease that out and compare it to other states, we are investing far less. So I hope that makes sense. And I don't know if I explained it very well, but so for the need that we have, for the number of low-income students in public schools, for the number of special ed students, and for the number of multilingual learners that Delaware has, the amount that we invest in our public education system is actually far below where it needs to be. So the other states who invest far more also invest far more for the type of student that they have. Maybe if there's a state that invests a little bit less but has better outcomes, you would find that they also have fewer students with learning disabilities and lower rates of poverty. So you can't just take one element and not consider all the other factors. So all those factors matter. So again, the AIR report aimed to take all those factors into consideration. And when you take into consideration the number of students living, public school students living below the poverty line, the number of public school students with learning disabilities, and the number who are multilingual learners, they found that we are underinvesting by 600 million to $1 billion. They did not, although this has been reported, but it's not, they did not say which funding system we should use. They talked about how much more we should be spending. They talked about how we compare to other states, but they didn't say, and it's our conclusion that you should go to a weighted student funding system and you should drop the old unit count system. The report does not tell us what funding system to use. It just tells us that we're not investing enough. So from my perspective, investing more in our schools is the number one aim. And the number two is figuring out how to make sure the investments are going where they're most needed. Clearly, students from low-income backgrounds need more resources. Anyone who's been a classroom teacher can tell you that if you have a class full of students and some of them are from wealthy or privileged backgrounds where they were read to a lot at home and they had access to books at home, they had access to lots of language-rich environment, and they were being taken to museums and talked to by people who had good vocabularies. Their parents talked to them a lot. They grew up hearing a lot of language, reading a lot of language, being surrounded by culturally rich experiences. They don't need as much from their school, from their teacher, as a student who grew up with far, far less of that. So we have to make sure that regardless of which system we use, unit count, weighted student, or hybrid, how do we ensure that the resources are going to the students who need them most? And it can be done really in using either of the systems or a hybrid system. One of the ways, and then I'll stop and answer questions. One of the things that we seem to have a decent amount of consensus around is really looking at changing referendum. We are one of like 3 or 4 states left in the nation that still goes out for referendum to raise school taxes. One of the problems with having school taxes based on your property values is it creates this completely backward situation where school districts that are in property rich areas have more money. So the kids who go to those schools are already kids with more privilege, and their communities can afford to give them more, and yet they don't need as much from their schools because they're getting a lot of supplemental education from home. And then the students who live in low income areas and low property value areas, they can't afford to raise their property taxes. Even if they raise their property taxes, their properties aren't worth as much. So they who need more from their public school system because they're relying on the public school system to supplement what they're not getting at home, they can actually afford less. So there's something currently called equalization that attempts to address that problem. And I've been to a bunch of equalization meetings, and at every meeting, the conclusion is the system's broken, we have to fix it, but there's no political will to fix it. So that's the first thing we have to do. Either we need to fix equalization, even though that means some hard choices. We have to allow schools to raise the school tax without having to go to referendum, at least for operating costs. So, you don't have the situation where they're putting all these resources. It costs money to run a referendum, and it takes a lot of time and effort. They spend about a year planning for it. That's a year they're not looking at programming. They're not looking at hiring. They're looking at figuring out how to convince the taxpayers that it's worth it for them to vote yes on the referendum. And then they still sometimes fail. and then they have another chance like within a month or so to go out again and try again. And then if they fail, they have to wait several years before they can try again, or a year, I don't know. But it's just this really time consuming, expensive process that I think sets up our neediest students for failure. Um, because after all, there's no other tax that Delawareans get to vote directly on whether or not to be taxed on. Everything else is through your representation, who you get to vote for. School board members are representatives that you get to vote for. Why not allow the school boards to raise up to a certain percentage, a reasonable percentage, tie it to inflation if you want, tie it to CPI, whatever you need to do, but for operating costs. Because what happens now is, since people don't get to vote on whether or not you raise their taxes directly for anything else, when they get the opportunity for this one thing, the school tax, they're more likely to be like, heck yeah, I think my taxes are too high, so this is my chance to vote no, to vote no because I'm mad about taxes in general. And so I think it's a perverse incentive to 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 go out for referendum every time you just need to raise operating taxes. I'm fine with referendum if you want to do something extraordinary, you want to build some extraordinary, you want to build a brand new building or a new gym or a new soccer field, but when it comes to the everyday, like ongoing expenses that are quite predictable, like paying your staff and maintaining the programs people have come to rely on, the after school programming and things like that, I really would like to see us move away from referendum for that. So that's one thing we're looking at. And then the other thing is like deciding hybrid model, completely toss out unit count and go to weighted student funding, or keep unit count and only fix equalization that is meant to sort of, I don't know, one idea is to put all the property taxes into one pot and then redistribute the wealth as it's where it's most needed. Uh, but I don't know how popular politically that will be, because then the people in the richer districts may not like seeing their money going, to other districts rather than to their own. So we'll see. So I don't know. That's an overview of what we have to decide and what the commission's job is to do and what we're using as our guide, the AIR report. And I'm happy to answer any questions about anything that wasn't clear or that I forgot to address.
Thank you, Laura. I have one question. When you talk about the two formulas, the two approaches,
Yeah.
you're not just talking about the allocation of the state level funding. You're talking about the allocation of all the funding, including that which is generated by the referendums? Is it all one pot of
Yes,
money or?
yes, yes. Oh, if you're talking about the state and the local, yes,
Okay.
yeah. Although currently, like the opportunity funding is all state, I think. But then I think the locals try, for example, if we give a raise to teachers on the state side, the locals try to match, like right now it's roughly 70-30. So like the state pays 70% of the school expenses, and the local, based on property taxes or school taxes, pay about 30%. So if the state gives a raise, the raise is only on that 70%. But what the local districts will try to do is match that by raising their portion, up to what the state, but they only have responsibility for 30%. They don't have to though. So like if the state gives a raise on the state portion, the local does not have to match it. There's no requirement that they do. But in order to remain competitive with other districts, they usually do, or they try to.
And so does any of this vary district by district, or is it pretty much done the same across the state?
It varies because that's why like people in different school districts get paid different amounts. So let's say a teacher who has 15 years experience, a master's degree, um, well, those would be the main two things, your years of experience and your degrees, right? So a 15-year teacher with a master's degree will make more uh, in in one district than in another, and that's not obviously the state side of that is fixed. Every teacher with 15 years and a master's makes the exact same amount in terms of the state portion of their salary. What differs is the local portion of their salary. Uh, so it does create a situation where, based on which district you work in, you might make more or less than someone with the exact same experience and degree.
Sounds a little bit like the rich get richer, but hey.
Yeah, yeah. Like the highest paid school districts, kind of historically have been the Newcastle County VOTEC, which, by the way, they don't have to go out for referendum ever, but they do still get to raise their the local portion of their taxes, and the and Brandywine School District historically have been two of the highest paid districts, and yet, you Red Clay and Brandywine, are abut one another, but a teacher in Red Clay would make a little less than a teacher in Brandywine, even if they have the exact same background, years of experience, et cetera. So yeah. And then you go downstate and the salaries tend to go much lower.
Roger?
In the report about the funding, did it emphasize certain areas? Because you've got so much. You've got possibility of the meals, giving kids meals. You've got facilities. You've got salaries. You've got class size. You've got after school, which you mentioned. You even got, well, a big problem in Delaware is truancy. So where did the report say this is where you're most unequal and this is where you have to bring it up the most?
So that's a good question. And I even, I had a public hearing about the AIR report, mostly for legislators to learn about it. And one of the things I asked is, like, could you talk about where should we invest our dollars in terms of, you know, should we be spending it on personnel? Should we be spending it on programming? Should we spend like what? And they don't want to really talk about that. Um, they they tell us how much overall we should be spending to be similar to the states that, are more successful. But they won't tell us what is the best way to spend the money. And I think part of the resistance to that is, there's a lot of belief in local control and wanting the local leaders to have the flexibility to spend the dollars in the way they think their communities and their students need, will benefit the most. Um, so they prefer to talk in terms of pots of money and how much money rather than how it should be spent. So beyond, the only thing they will say is you need more money for low income, multilingual learners and spec ed. That everyone agrees those students need more because they need more. But what that more looks like is sort of left up to the local decision makers, or I mean, the state could decide to come in and say, and this is how you should spend it. But the AIR report did not tell us how to spend it. My personal opinion, which I'll share because, hey, I'm here, I might as well, from my 25 years of teaching, is the biggest difference. Like what did I wish I had when I was a teacher and I had classes of 30 students. I had situations like this. I sound like a broken record because every chance I get, I bring this up. But I had a class, it wasn't just once. There were a couple of years where I had several classes, 30 students, 15 of them had individualized education plans, meaning they had learning disabilities that required special accommodations. 30 total, 15 needing special accommodations. Of those 15 needing special accommodations, they didn't all need the same accommodations. They needed a variety. Each one had their own very specific needs that had to be met. And I was the sole teacher in the classroom with no co-teacher, no paraprofessional, no spec ed support. And I somehow had to meet the needs of all 30 students, the 15 who didn't have special needs of any kind, the 15 that had identified special needs. Oh, and the 15 that didn't have special needs, that's not really fair to say because they might have been low income. But at that time, we didn't give more support for low income. They might have been traumatized by all kinds of things, but they didn't happen to have IEPs, individualized education plans. So from my experience, what I came to conclude is that the best investment we can make is in smaller class sizes, especially for diverse classes. I mean, if you think about a college class, if you get, you can have a lecture of 200 students. If they're all students who got into that college because they had high enough SAT scores, right? And they had a good enough grade point average, they can sit in a lecture and they can do fine, even though there's 200 of them, because there's not a lot of variety, right? So even I think the same holds true at the high school and the middle school level. Like if you have a class where they're all truly honors kids or AP kids, you could have a larger group and they'll do fine. You know, they're highly motivated. They're going home to a quiet environment where they can study. They're not going home to a chaotic environment where there's nowhere to concentrate. Um, so, but the more diverse in terms of income and learning disabilities and all that, the smaller you need the class size to be. But yet we don't make those adjustments. We have inclusion now, which is great. We have students with learning disabilities in the class with the students who don't have learning disabilities. I think that's fine, but the more students with special needs in a class, the higher the percentage of students with special needs, the smaller the class needs to be, or alternatively, you need to provide a second teacher. And that's something that I have a bill that I wrote a couple years ago that I've just been waiting for the right moment to introduce that would require classrooms that have greater diversity of need to be either smaller or provide a second teacher. Um, what's held me up from introducing it is the teacher shortage. Um, you know, how do you either create a smaller class or have a second teacher when you have a teacher shortage, which is actually pushing us in the opposite direction of bigger classes. So hopefully the PECC, which was the commission that raised teacher salaries to a base salary of 60K within the next now 2 years, will help solve the teacher shortage. And once we're no longer in a teacher shortage situation, we can look at solutions like making class sizes smaller and having second teachers. So I think I think most of the studies show the most important and the biggest factor in whether a student succeeds or not is that teacher in front of them. How, whether that teacher is able to build a bond, get to know them, get to know their quirks and how, what motivates them. It's really hard to get to know what motivates each of your students if you have 30 of them and 15 have very, very, very specific, intense special needs that you need to address. So that would be my choice of where to spend the money.
Thank you.
Sandy?
Sandy?
Yes. Roger and I have 3 children that went through the public schools, and I would be so thrilled to hear that we're getting rid of referendums, because I don't know how many times we went through the referendum process where we had a lot of friends who would say, oh, my kids are in private schools, I'm voting against it. And you have people, I'm living on a fixed income, I'm voting against it, because again, you get asked, do you want your taxes raised? And I remember the frustration of going through all that, negative replies to being asked that question. And it just seemed like we shouldn't be asked that question. It should be taken care of. It should be provided like other things are provided. And as you said before, it shouldn't be something that people get to vote on. And the other thing I was going to mention is if you are getting funded for special situations that students have, then the money should be going to them. So you should not be having classes with 30 kids that have all these issues.
Yep.
So is there a way, I mean, if you're funded for that, why couldn't the money be channeled that way? And then we, again, wouldn't have the horrible.
Well, that is a great point, and that's the argument that those who support my bill and I have been trying to make. It's like, you already, because I remember when I first showed the bill around and I took it to the Comptroller General's office to ask if my bill would have a fiscal note. And the Comptroller General came back and said, no, your bill like my bill had very specific, like if the class has more than, I don't know, 30% of the students have special needs, then the class can be no bigger than 15. And if it is bigger than 15, then you have to provide a second teacher. Like it was very, very, like it broke it down. So then I was like, so how much would this cost the state? And the controller general told me nothing because the schools already get money, exactly what you said, for students with special needs. So then why aren't they doing it? Well, apparently what the school districts will tell you is, well, we do get more money per pupil with special needs, but remember how I was saying like they can spend that money on a teacher, a spec ed teacher, but they could also spend it on a counselor or a librarian, or they even like they don't even get paid to hire IT professionals. Well, obviously nowadays everything's on the computers. There's even remote classes sometimes. There's asynchronous days where the students log in from home. Um, so they have to pay for not just teachers through that generated unit, but all these other positions. And so they end up just doing this thing where like it's like a blanket that's not, it's like a twin size blanket trying to cover a queen size bed. Sometimes the analogy I use. But you're right. If they took every penny that they get for students with special needs and they spent it on hiring more teachers and more spec ed teachers and not on hiring all these other things, then they should have enough to do the right thing and keep the classes smaller or provide the second teacher in the room. But right now, the flexibility that they would say they need to hire other important positions that aren't funded, that's the problem. Not every position is funded. So they take the units that are maybe were originally intended to be teaching units and they spend it on other types of things. Again, we're underfunding our schools. We should be able to afford enough teachers to have smaller class sizes or a second teacher in the classrooms with a lot of special needs and be able to afford a librarian and be able to afford enough counselors, right? And be able to afford an IT person or two, depending on the size of the school. And yet we can't. So they just, to make the dollars stretch, they end up with these terrible situations like those.
So is your commission going to address that issue, Laura?
Well, yes, it's going to address, I hope that our commission, I'll put it this way. If our commission is willing to not only say what the funding system should be, but also how much we should be investing in our public schools, then the problem should take care of itself because the money will be there to hire, the positions that need to be hired. Then what we'll do is I'm going to talk about 4 pillars that I think are really important for everyone to think about. Adequacy, are our schools getting enough money? Oh God, well, yeah, my 4 pillars. So I can think of 3 of them now. The 4th one just threw up. Oh, okay, I got it. Adequacy, are the schools getting enough money? Equity, is the money going where it's needed? Is more money going to the schools that need more, the classrooms that need more? But then there's accountability and flexibility. One of the things that people like about the weighted student funding system is it's very, very flexible, which allows for more accountability, because this is how I think of it. If you are allowing the local school leaders to decide how to spend the money, and then the students continue to do really poorly, then you can hold them accountable.
Mhm.
But right now, what happens, because every penny is like, well, you can, is based on a formula that's not flexible at all. The local school leaders can kind of throw up their hands and say, well, we spent the money that the way you told us we had to spend it. So we're going to have to figure out the balance of maintaining some of the things that people like about the unit count is that it's reliable and stable. But what they don't like is that it's not flexible. And then, of course, the public wants accountability, and they deserve it. So we're going to have to find the right balance of making sure we're giving enough money, but we're giving also enough flexibility that we can then hold people accountable for how they spend those dollars. And if they're not spending them in a way that's making a difference, but yet we know we're giving them enough, then we can insist that they spend a different way. And if they don't, then we find someone else who will. So these are all, there's a lot of parts, but so I hope that if we do invest more, and then we give more flexibility, which they've been asking for, the administrators, the high level administrators want more flexibility. They say, well, you tie our hands too much. Well, okay. But then you realize if we give you that flexibility, then you're going to be held accountable for the outcomes. So
And this commission is 31 people?
it's huge. Yeah, it started even bigger and we pared it down. And yet you would not believe the number of people who've come forward and say, but why am I not on the commissioners? Why is my group not? We tried our best to have every major stakeholder group represented. And there's still, groups saying, we wish we could have been on it too. But it's public. All our meetings are open to the public. They're on the public meeting calendar on the General Assembly website. They're also on the Department of Education's page. If you find their government page, there's a link to join. You can watch them live. You can listen to them after the fact. You can sign up for public comment at the end of each of those meetings. So that's what I tell people who didn't make it onto the commission. Come and listen and speak. You will get your time to speak, so yeah.
Let's see, Norm, I think you have a question. We're coming to the end of our time, but Norm, you're up.
Laurel, on what date is it determined that how many units are in the school district?
September 30th.
That's the way it was 40 years ago.
Yeah,
There's a lot of monkey business about that. You retain people you shouldn't have. And after we get the 1st of October, so you belong to the district next door.
Right. So I think we passed a bill to have a second unit count in January. But the districts were like, well, wait a minute, if our funding is based on how many students we have on September 30th, and we budget for that, and then we lose students between September 30th and January 30th, you can't take away money from us because we've already budgeted based on our September 30th count. So I don't know, I forget exactly where it all landed, but I think the problem with it was they wanted to be held harmless if they lost students, but the districts and schools who got more students wanted to be made whole by getting more money. And then, of course, that led to a rather expensive outcome for the taxpayers because you're going to continue to pay the schools who lose students the same amount as the number of students they had on September 30th, but you're going to give more money to the schools who grew between September 30th and January 30th. And to be completely honest, I don't remember how they decided to figure all that out, but that is the problem with having a January 30th unit count. The schools don't want to give up the money they were promised on after September 30th.
Yeah. Well, I remember with that unit count, all of a sudden in early October, a whole bunch of students came in and said, we're registering in your school. Where'd you come from? Oh, across town. There's monkey business being played, used to be played with that system.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that would help the school that lost those students because they'd keep the money, but it would, of course, hurt the school that got the students. I'm sure there's monkey business. I mean, there are people who will tell you, and I am not making this claim, but there are people who think, and I've heard other legislators make the claim that one of the reasons why so many students are identified as having a learning disability is because for each, right, we talked about it. If you have a learning disability, then you get more money. And so the schools, in their desperation to have more money to meet the needs of all students, it behooves them to identify students as learning disabled, whether they need that label or not. I don't know. I mean, I would hate to think professionals are, mislabeling students to get more money. But again, if the whole system is underfunded, then it incentivizes that kind of really bad behavior. If we're funding the system adequately, there will not be a temptation to over-identify students just so you could get more money for your school. So I'll leave it at that. But I want to be clear, I'm not accusing anyone of doing that, but I have heard people suggest that that happens.
That's all right. We won't tell a soul.
Okay, yeah, except for you're recording this.
I know, but we'll blank out your face and your name and no one will know. Yeah. Thank you all for being here. You know, this is a really critical issue for Delaware. It has been for the longest time. And what we want is to have a system that prepares our children for success, that doesn't penalize them because of where they live or who their parents are or other factors over which they have no control. That we recognize that some students need more help than others, and we want to do the very best we can for all. And that we particularly want to be sure that those who have sort of been left behind by being stuck in a part of the city or in a school district that doesn't have the financial wherewithal, these students today shouldn't be paying the price for that, the penalty for that. So we are Westminster's Peace and Justice Work Group sponsoring these programs. People come for all sorts of reasons, but I just want to say God bless you, Laura, and best of luck
Yeah, wish us luck.
in the work that you're doing. It's so important. And thank you
Thank
for
you.
sharing the time with us this evening.
And Sue, thank you for that summation at the end. That very well said, very well said. This is what we all hope, that every student gets the resources they need, regardless of, the situation that they're growing up in. And hopefully this commission will lead to that. So definitely wish us luck and pray for us.
All right, and we'll be watching. We'll be paying attention and offering whatever support we can.
Thank you so much. Good night, everybody.
Thank you all for
so
being
much.
here. Good
Good night.
night.
Thank you. Good night.